My name was not on the priority evacuation list. My husband delivered this information over the deafening, rhythmic roar of the Black Hawk helicopter's rotors, his tone as casual as if he were reading the morning weather forecast for the Seattle metropolitan area. The ground beneath our boots was still vibrating the dying tremors of the Cascadia fault line settling deep within the earth. Emergency strobes' harsh, blinding flashes of crimson and white painted the pulverized concrete of the Rainier Annex Industrial Park. Dust rolled through the damp Pacific Northwest air in suffocating charcoal gray waves, mixing with the persistent drizzle to coat everything in a layer of suffocating grime. Somewhere in the chaotic darkness behind the collapsed remnants of Sector 4, the shrieking, agonizing sound of yielding metal echoed as another steel I-beam buckled under the impossible weight of the ruined infrastructure. Thaddeus Thorne stood precisely 10 feet away from me. His arm was wrapped protectively around the shoulders of another woman. Serafina Delacroix was wearing his waterproof Patagonia tactical jacket. Smears of expensive waterproof mascara stained her high cheekbones. But even amidst the apocalyptic dust, the terror, and the blaring sirens, she clung to his torso with the innate, unshakable confidence of a woman who knew exactly where she belonged. Thaddeus held her tight, his broad shoulders angled to shield her trembling frame with his own body. Meanwhile, I stood abandoned against a fractured retaining wall, the metallic tang of dried blood coating my palms. A deep, blooming bruise was already mottling the skin of my abdomen, the exact spot where he had shoved me out of his way half an hour earlier when the secondary tremors hit. The rescue chopper sat idling on the cracked tarmac, its side doors locked open like the jaws of a mechanical beast. The violent downdraft off the blades whipped my matted hair across my eyes and filled my throat with a taste of ash and dirt. A medevac rescue captain, clad in a high-visibility yellow helmet and a heavy turnout coat, stood by the boarding steps. He held a ruggedized tablet, his gloved finger scrolling aggressively as he cross-referenced the digital manifest with the frantic survivors. Thaddeus pushed Serafina forward his hand, resting possessively on the small of her back. "Her name is Serafina Delacroix," Thaddeus shouted over the turbine whine. "She's essential corporate personnel. Tier 2 communications liaison. She needs to be on this bird right now." The captain squinted at his illuminated tablet, swiped once, and then shifted his gaze over Thaddeus's shoulder, his eyes landing directly on me. "And what about this woman?" Thaddeus didn't even bother to glance back. "She's not on the manifest. She's not essential. Not essential." 5 years of marriage. 5 years of meticulously curated dinner parties designed to impress his superiors at Aegis Vanguard Infrastructure. 5 years of carrying the agonizing, invisible mental load of our household so his mind could remain entirely focused on climbing the corporate ladder. My own savings, accumulated from my years as a financial analyst, aggressively poured into the down payment of the sleek, glass-walled Queen Anne townhouse he loved to refer to as our achievement. I had leveraged every favor, every networking connection I possessed to help him secure his first executive promotion. My own bodily autonomy and my future had been placed on indefinite hold because he always had an excuse. "Not yet, Calliope. Not until my regional directorship is locked in. We can't afford the distraction of a baby right now." I thought about the senior VP role in Chicago. I had agonizingly declined 3 years ago because Thaddeus insisted our marriage couldn't survive a bicoastal arrangement, and his career in Seattle was clearly on the faster trajectory. I thought about the countless soul-crushing Sunday brunches spent at his mother Cordelia's sprawling estate on Mercer Island, organizing her charity galas while she passive-aggressively critiqued my choice of floral arrangements and reminded me how fortunate I was that Thaddeus had chosen a woman of my pedestrian background. I thought about the profound silence with which I had absorbed every microaggression, every slight, constantly feeding myself the toxic delusion that true love meant boundless patience. And finally, as the dust began to settle on the ruined tarmac and a violent aftershock began to rumble deep within the bedrock, I was reduced to 2 words: not essential. I watched with terrifying clarity as Thaddeus guided Serafina toward the steel steps of the chopper. I watched the rescue captain hesitate his moral compass, fighting the bureaucratic protocol on his screen. I watched Thaddeus tighten his jaw, his posture radiating that familiar, entitled arrogance, the physical manifestation of a man who believed he could bully the universe into rearranging itself to accommodate his lies. Slowly, deliberately, I reached inside my dust-caked fleece pullover. My cold fingers brushed against the small, matte black microvault flash drive, secured tightly to the skin over my sternum with waterproof medical tape. My late father had given it to me 2 weeks before he passed away. He had been an old-school cybersecurity architect for the Department of Defense, a paranoid, brilliant man who fundamentally trusted redundant backup systems far more than he ever trusted human beings. I had laughed when he handed it to me. I wasn't laughing anymore. My thumb located the tiny indented red node on the side of the casing. I didn't press it. Not yet. I was going to wait until Thaddeus had completely and irreversibly destroyed himself. 72 hours earlier, I had still been desperately trying to salvage a dinner with my husband. We had a reservation for our 5th wedding anniversary at the Zenith, a breathtakingly pretentious glass-walled dining room suspended on the 50th floor of the Columbia Center, overlooking the glittering skyline of downtown Seattle. It was the kind of establishment where the sommeliers spoke in hushed, reverent tones. The lighting was perpetually dim, and the tasting menus conspicuously lacked printed prices. I had booked the corner table a month in advance, securing it with a non-refundable deposit paid out of my own annual bonus, because Thaddeus had completely forgotten our anniversary date until I had gently placed the itinerary on his keyboard. He arrived 41 minutes late. The collar of his bespoke Italian dress shirt was slightly rumpled, sitting asymmetrical against his neck. The thick dark hair at his temples looked suspiciously ruffled, as if someone's fingers had recently tangled in it. When he leaned down to offer a perfunctory obligatory kiss to my cheek, a heavy cloying scent wafted off his lapel. It was Baccarat Rouge, 540. Sweet, woody, aggressively expensive. A scent I never wore. "Emergency board call," he said smoothly, exhaling a breathless sigh as he dropped his heavy leather briefcase by the table and collapsed into the plush velvet chair opposite me. "You know how it is. The grid modernization project is a nightmare." I picked up my silver steak knife, meticulously sliced a minuscule piece of my Wagyu filet, placed it on my porcelain plate, and looked him dead in the eye. Was Serafina on the board call too? His fork paused mid-air. For a fraction of a second, the charismatic facade slipped. Then his features locked into a rigid mask of practiced exasperation. "Why are we bringing her up tonight, Calliope?" "Really? Because every time you walk through our front door, you bring her presence into the house with you." Thaddeus let out a sharp, humorless exhale. "Callie, she is the Deputy Director of Market Strategy. She's quarterbacking the Pacific Northwest Resilience Initiative. You simply don't understand how operations at this altitude function." I didn't dignify that with a response. Serafina Delacroix had transferred into Aegis Vanguard infrastructure 4 months prior. She was 31, aggressively tailored, ruthlessly ambitious, and possessed a razor-sharp, striking beauty that seemed genetically engineered for high-stakes boardrooms and dimly lit hotel cocktail lounges. At first, Thaddeus had mentioned her name constantly. Serafina solved a massive supply chain bottleneck. Serafina speaks the shareholders' language. Serafina really understands crisis optics. Then abruptly, he stopped mentioning her entirely. The sudden silence was infinitely worse than the praise. 2 months ago, he started placing his iPhone face down on the granite kitchen island. 6 weeks ago, he changed his biometric lock to an alphanumeric passcode. 4 weeks ago, while looking for registration papers in his Audi, I found a tube of lipstick wedged deep in the crevices of the passenger seat. Tom Ford. Shade Scarlet Rouge. Not my brand. Not my color. Not the kind of luxury purchased by a woman who spends her weekends doing compliance audits and comparing organic produce prices at the local farmer's market. I hadn't screamed. I hadn't thrown the tube at his head. I had simply rolled the lipstick back down, placed it exactly where I found it, and waited to see if the guilt would ever compel him to confess. It never did. That night at the Zenith, after the waiter cleared our practically untouched entrees, Thaddeus reached down into his briefcase and slid a thick, staple-bound legal document across the crisp white tablecloth. "I need your signature on this," he said, his tone shifting into the authoritative cadence he used with his subordinates. I looked down at the cover page. The bold capitalized header read, "Declaration and Authorization for Emergency Household Asset Management." The legalese was dense, clinically professional, and utterly terrifying. It explicitly stated that in the event of a major catastrophic declaration, operational incapacitation, mandated evacuation, or emergency logistical disruption, Thaddeus would be granted unilateral, unmitigated power of attorney to manage, transfer, liquidate, or encumber all joint marital assets. This included our joint checking accounts, my Vanguard brokerage portfolio, the vehicles, our retirement distributions, and the Queen Anne townhouse, all without requiring any further consent from me, provided the action was reasonably deemed necessary for survival or asset protection. Reasonably deemed necessary was a legal loophole so astronomically wide you could drive an armored truck through it. "What exactly is this?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Thaddeus sighed heavily, massaging the bridge of his nose as if my cautiousness was a physical burden he was forced to bear. "Aegis is bidding on a massive federal Department of Homeland Security resilience contract. DHS is requiring all upper echelon executives to legally demonstrate that our private households are structurally prepared for emergency deployment. It's a standard bureaucratic compliance checklist, Callie. It just gives me temporary administrative control over the property if the grid goes down. The townhouse is ours, I said, my pulse beginning to throb in my throat. My parents' inheritance paid for 70% of the down payment. His face hardened instantly. The charming urbane mask of Thaddeus Thorne vanished entirely, replaced by the cold, calculating man who lurked beneath the tailored suits. He looked at me with raw, unfiltered impatience. For God's sake, Calliope, why do you have to micromanage and catastrophize everything? I am on the verge of making regional director with a federal contract that will permanently alter our tax bracket. All you have to do is sign a standard liability form. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. A form that simply allows me to streamline our holdings in a worst-case scenario. I am your husband. Who else are you possibly going to trust? He spoke loudly enough that the affluent couple at the adjacent table discreetly averted their eyes. For 5 years, Thaddeus had weaponized that exact phrase. It was his skeleton key to end every argument. I am your husband. Trust me. Stop questioning my judgment. Support my vision. Be grateful. Be a good corporate wife. I picked up the heavy brass pen he had provided. His tense shoulders immediately dropped an inch. His expression softened. He even managed to produce a tight, reassuring smile. Good, he murmured, taking a sip of his Cabernet. I knew you'd understand the optics. I signed my name with deliberate, agonizing slowness. Calliope Vance Thorne. I pressed the ballpoint down with such ferocious intensity that it carved a physical groove into the thick parchment paper. Thaddeus visibly relaxed. He eagerly snatched the document, tucked it safely away in his leather briefcase, ordered an astronomically priced bottle of Bordeaux without bothering to consult me, and spent the remainder of our anniversary dinner aggressively texting someone under the table. I'm shipping out tomorrow morning, he announced between rapid thumbstrokes on his screen. Full-scale emergency response simulation at the Rainier Annex facility. It's a 3-day field bivouac. Total blackout conditions. Serafina will be on-site handling the interagency stakeholder comms. Do you want me to drive you to the staging area? I asked, my voice hollow. No. Corporate is dispatching a black car. His phone screen illuminated again. He read the notification and the absolute corners of his mouth twitched upward into a genuine private smirk before he could suppress it. That fleeting smile hurt infinitely more than the draconian legal document resting in his bag. We drove back to our townhouse in a suffocating silence that felt entirely absolute. Upon arriving, Thaddeus immediately took a hurried shower and retreated into his home office, claiming he had an urgent late-night prep call for the drill. He didn't pull the heavy oak door completely shut. He either forgot, or he simply no longer cared that the acoustics in the modern open-concept house carried sound effortlessly. I stood in the darkened hallway, pressing my spine against the cold drywall and listened. Serafina's voice drifted clearly from the speakers of his MacBook, low, husky, and dripping with profound amusement. So, did the little homemaker sign it? Thaddeus let out a soft, mocking chuckle. Of course she signed it. Applied a tiny bit of pressure, threw in some corporate buzzwords about my promotion, and she folded. She always folds. She's terrified of being seen as unsupportive. Perfect. And the emergency manifest handled. I finalized the alterations an hour ago. You and I are locked into the Tier 1 Rotary Wing evacuation group. If there's an actual structural compromise during the simulation, you have top-level extraction priority. And Calliope, Thaddeus said my name the way one might regard chewing gum stuck to the sole of a designer shoe. Calliope is irrelevant. I removed her exemption. If there's actual chaos, no one is going to waste fuel worrying about a redundant spouse. She can take a bus with the civilian extras. Serafina laughed. The sound was crystalline, piercing, and utterly repulsive. I stood in the shadows of the hallway until the violent trembling in my knees finally subsided. Then I walked silently into the master bedroom, locked the door behind me, and dragged a vintage metal lockbox down from the highest shelf of my closet. Inside lay a faded photograph from my sophomore year at Reed College. A cheap silver promise ring Thaddeus had bought me when we were 21, and the heavy matte black microvault drive my father had pressed into my hand shortly before his final surgery. Human beings are inherently flawed. Callie, my dad, had rasped from his hospital bed. Systems fail a lot less if you engineer them yourself. Keep this on you. It's an EMP-shielded localized audio capture drive. It records geotags and uploads 256-bit encrypted data directly to a secure offshore cloud server the moment it catches a signal. The decryption key is your mother's maiden name reversed. Don't tell your husband about it. At the time, I had hugged his frail shoulders and tearfully joked, "Dad, I'm getting married, I'm not joining the NSA." He hadn't laughed. Now staring at the blinking LED indicator light, I finally understood. The next morning, Thaddeus departed before dawn with an olive-drab tactical duffel bag and a dry kiss aimed somewhere near my left temple. Cell towers might be simulated down in the drill zone, he warned smoothly. Don't panic if you can't reach me. I'll see you Sunday night. The front door clicked shut. I stood by the bay window and waited precisely until the taillights of his Audi disappeared around the corner of the steep Queen Anne Street. Then I picked up my phone and called Evander Sterling. Evander had been 2 years ahead of me at Reed College. He had since become one of the most ruthless, highly sought-after family law attorneys in the Pacific Northwest, a man famous for his surgical litigation strategies and his absolute zero-tolerance policy for men who attempted to disguise financial abuse as simple misunderstandings. Calliope Vance Evander said the moment he answered, skipping the pleasantries. I've been wondering what year you were finally going to call me. I need your help, Evander. His tone shifted from collegial to lethally sharp in a microsecond. Where are you right now? Are you physically safe? Talk to me. I told him everything. I explained the asset management authorization. I told him about the cracked office door, the late-night laptop call, the altered emergency evacuation manifest, and Serafina Delacroix. For the first time in 5 years, I let the ugly, humiliating truth pour out of my mouth without actively trying to soften the edges to protect Thaddeus's reputation. Evander didn't interrupt once. When I finally stopped speaking, the silence on the line stretched for a long, heavy moment. Scan that executed authorization document and send it to my encrypted portal right now, Evander commanded. Do not wait. I want you to pull every shred of evidence regarding your parents' financial contribution to that townhouse. Wire transfer receipts, escrow closing documents, old emails from the real estate broker, even the handwritten note your mother gave you. Evander called me back exactly 14 minutes later. This authorization form is a thermonuclear weapon, Evander said, his voice tight. It's not automatically enforceable if we can prove it was obtained under fraudulent pretenses, but it is dangerous enough that we need to preemptively strike. I am drafting an emergency revocation order, a postnuptial asset clarification filing, and a massive preservation notice. We are going to prep an ex parte emergency restraining order on all financial accounts in case he tries to move a single dime while he's playing soldier in the mud. What else do you need? I need the Aegis Vanguard disaster response simulation files. Passenger manifests, signal assignments, contingency protocols. Whatever you can dig up. I have a buddy over at the Washington State Emergency Management Division. I'll make some quiet inquiries. Furthermore, I'm putting my private investigator on retainer immediately. I want his hotel records, overlapping travel itineraries, itemized credit card statements, and whatever digital footprint Serafina Delacroix has left behind. Evander took a deep breath. Callie. If he is utilizing a federally mandated public safety drill to orchestrate a hostile financial takeover against you, we aren't just talking about a messy divorce. We are encroaching on federal wire fraud and criminal endangerment. Good, I replied, my voice steady. Then let's call it what it is. After hanging up, I spent 12 consecutive hours building a fortress of evidence brick by agonizing brick. I downloaded joint bank statements, mortgage amortization schedules, my parents' wire confirmations insurance riders, and the Vanguard portfolio summaries. I took high-resolution screenshots of Thaddeus's erratic spending habits, including digital receipts from a local boutique for a diamond tennis bracelet that had never touched my wrist. At noon, my mother-in-law Cordelia called. Thaddeus is out of pocket, she announced without saying hello, her voice dripping with patrician entitlement. I need you to drive over to Mercer Island this evening. The landscapers left the heavy terracotta planters on the wrong side of the patio, and your father-in-law simply cannot be expected to move them. I can't lift heavy terracotta planters either, Cordelia. A frigid silence descended over the line. In half a decade, I had rarely, if ever, told this woman no. I apologize, but I have critical personal matters to attend to today, I continued smoothly. I suggest you call the estate management company. Offer them double overtime. Offer them double overtime! Cordelia's voice pitched upward in aristocratic outrage. How incredibly generous with my money. Calliope, you seem to have forgotten that you married into a family of consequence. My son could have had his pick of pedigree. Yet you consistently act as though basic familial loyalty is beneath you. Cordelia, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. I am unavailable. Do not speak to me in that tone ever again. I terminated the call. Then I blocked her number. The absolute quiet that filled the kitchen afterward was so profound it physically ached. By nightfall, Evander had legally filed the revocation of the power of attorney. He also sent me a strict directive. Do not inform Thaddeus until the financial freeze is finalized by the judge. Evander's private investigator, a former Seattle PD detective named Bernadette Rourke, delivered her preliminary dossier just before midnight. The contents were utterly damning. Thaddeus and Serafina had checked into the Fairmont Olympic Hotel together 14 times in the past 4 months. He had opened a clandestine secondary credit card under her name tied to our joint account. More terrifyingly, Thaddeus had requisitioned 2 experimental, military-grade GPS emergency locator beacons for the Rainier Annex drill, justifying the expense as a field test for next-gen rescue telemetry. One transponder was registered to him. The second was registered to his critical communications liaison, Serafina. Detective Rourke had also managed to breach a shared cloud storage folder Thaddeus arrogantly believed was secure. Inside was a fully drafted fraudulent debt ledger. According to the fabricated documents, Serafina had supposedly loaned Thaddeus an exorbitant amount of personal capital to cover phantom gambling debts. The paperwork was meticulously forged to look legally binding promissory notes, falsified repayment schedules, a chain of fabricated emails, and a proposed divorce settlement wherein I would be forced to surrender my equity in the townhouse to absorb my half of the marital debt, waiving all rights to future spousal support. I sat at the kitchen island and read every single file until my eyes burned. Then I took a strip of waterproof kinesiology tape, secured my father's micro-vault drive directly against my skin beneath my shirt, right over my heart. I am not going to be quietly erased, I whispered to the empty, expensive house. The Rainier Annex disaster simulation commenced under a brooding, overcast Pacific Northwest sky. Local Seattle news affiliates were broadcasting live, hyping it up as the most comprehensive seismic response drill in Washington state history, simulating a 9 Cascadia subduction zone rupture. State emergency divisions, private contractors like Aegis, Vanguard, drone surveillance teams, FEMA medics, and military airlift squadrons had descended upon the decaying industrial park built on notoriously unstable landfill near the Puget Sound. I caught a brief glimpse of Thaddeus on a King 5 News broadcast. He was wearing an olive-green tactical jacket emblazoned with the AVI corporate logo, standing tall and authoritative as he briefed a cluster of state officials on emergency mesh network infrastructure. Serafina stood half a pace behind him, close enough that the waterproof fabric of her sleeve brushed intimately against his. They looked focused, elite, and untouchable. I muted the television and opened the heavily encrypted folder Evander had shared with me. The emergency evacuation manifest was there. The version Evander's contact at the State Emergency Management Division had pulled was a mess of redlined digital edits. Thaddeus was proudly listed as Tier 1 Lead Technical Commander. Serafina had been bumped from Tier 3 to Tier 1 through a manual special executive override. My name, Calliope Thorne, had been completely purged from the document Thaddeus submitted to corporate HR. However, in a separate, localized database maintained by King County Emergency Services, a database Thaddeus apparently didn't realize synced automatically with civilian records, I found a buried line item, Calliope Vance Thorne. Spouse, primary household contact. Tier 1, family safety exemption, confirmed. I stared at the glowing monitor. I was legally on the priority evacuation list. The county had mandated it for all executive spouses. Thaddeus hadn't merely forgotten to add me. He had gone out of his way to actively override the system and delete my existence to make room for Serafina. At exactly 2:17 p.m., the live news broadcast violently shuddered. The seasoned anchorman's voice hitched in panic. We are receiving unconfirmed reports of actual seismic ground displacement at the Rainier Annex staging area. Ladies and gentlemen, this does not appear to be part of the simulation. The camera feed violently pitched sideways, capturing a plume of dust rising from a crumbling warehouse before dissolving into static snow. My phone immediately began vibrating off the granite counter, flooded with emergency push notifications. Actual seismic event confirmed along Seattle Fault. Magnitude 6.4. Multiple structural collapses at Rainier Annex Industrial Park. Mass casualty protocols activated. Civilian comms disrupted. I stood paralyzed in the living room, feeling the heavy plastic of the hidden drive pressing into my chest. The fake disaster had just become a catastrophic reality. For one fleeting irrational second, the deeply ingrained instinct of a wife flared up. I wanted to call him. I wanted to know if he was bleeding, if he was trapped. Then the phantom audio of his voice from the laptop recording echoed in my mind. If there's actual chaos, no one is going to waste fuel worrying about a redundant spouse. The landline rang. It was Cordelia calling from an unblocked secondary number. She called 30 times in rapid succession. On the 31st ring, I finally picked up. "Where is Thaddeus?" she shrieked, her aristocratic composure completely shattered. "What have you heard? You need to drive down there right now and find him. You are his wife. Do your duty. I am at home, Cordelia. First responders are securing the perimeter." "At home? How dare you sit in that air-conditioned house while my son could be buried under concrete?" She was hyperventilating, sobbing, and hurling vitriol simultaneously. "If I receive an official casualty update, I will relay the information," I replied with dead-eyed calm. Then I disconnected the landline from the wall entirely. Just before dusk, Evander called my cell. "The first wave of medevac choppers is inbound," Evander reported rapidly. "They are extracting personnel strictly based on the digital priority matrix. Thad and his mistress are highly likely to be in the first airlift if they made it to the designated extraction zone." "Callie, listen to me. Stay exactly where you are. Do not go down there. Let the police handle it. I need to see it with my own eyes." "Evander." "No, you do not. You need to remain physically safe so our evidentiary filings can detonate tomorrow morning. I built this legal trap under the assumption you would be safely at home. You do not need to walk into a literal disaster zone just to prove a point to a narcissist." "I'm not going there to prove him wrong, Evander," I said quietly, as I laced up a pair of heavy leather hiking boots. "I am going there to let him prove me right." The silence on the line was thick with tension. Finally, Evander let out a sharp, frustrated breath. "If you go dark for more than 12 hours, I am filing everything. I'm dropping the thermonuclear option. The fraud suits the asset preservation, the criminal referrals to the district attorney, the divorce petition. Hell, even if you're dark for 6 hours. Calliope, please." He muttered a violent curse. "Keep your GPS location sharing turned on. And if you find a cop in a uniform, stick to them like superglue." "Understood." I dressed for war. Dark, tactical denim, heavy waterproof boots, a hooded rain shell, and an N95 respirator mask. I packed a tactical go bag with purified water, an external battery brick, my passport cache 3, printed copies of the legal power of attorney revocation, and the microvault drive pressed securely against my skin. The main arterial roads leading to the Rainier Annex were barricaded by Washington State Patrol 3 miles out. I parked my SUV in the shadowy lot of an abandoned strip mall and hiked the remaining distance through an overgrown service trail I had scouted on satellite maps months ago when Thaddeus was bragging about the location. It was reckless. It was arguably insane. It was also the absolute last foolish thing I would ever do for Thaddeus Thorne. The closer I got to the epicenter, the more the grim reality fractured away from the sanitized news broadcasts. The television cameras had clean angles and telephoto lenses. The reality on the ground was a suffocating hellscape. The air tasted of pulverized drywall and ruptured sewage lines. The agonizing wail of triage sirens bounced off the skeletal remains of collapsed warehouses. Harsh halogen floodlights turned the choking dust into a blinding white fog. Frantic voices screamed coordinates over cracking radios. I hugged the outer perimeter fence, slipping through a compromised chain-link gate, moving like a ghost through the chaotic fringes of the staging area, until I saw the spinning rotors of the Black Hawk helicopter. And then I saw Thaddeus. He was aggressively jabbing his finger at the rescue captain. "Captain, refresh the goddamn manifest." Thaddeus roared over the deafening mechanical shriek of the chopper. "This is mission-critical corporate intelligence. Serafina Delacroix is carrying localized telemetry data on her hard drives. She must be evacuated on this flight." Serafina stood trembling beside him, dwarfed by his oversized jacket, her manicured hands gripping his bicep like a vice. Her face was chalk white beneath the soot, but her eyes were darting, calculating, and fully alert. The captain wiped dust from his visor and aggressively tapped his ruggedized screen. "Mr. Thorne, this bird has strict maximum weight tolerances due to the wind shear. I have 11 confirmed Tier 1 personnel, and 1 unresolved seating conflict. Delacroix is flagged as unresolved. Your county network is lagging," Thaddeus snarled, stepping into the captain's physical space. "I manually overrode and amended the roster this morning. She has clearance. The state emergency manifest does not reflect that amendment as authorized." The captain glared at him, refusing to be intimidated by a man in a corporate windbreaker. "The cell towers are bouncing signals, but I just pulled the hardlined update from King County Dispatch 10 minutes ago. It shows a completely different name for that final seat." Thaddeus's jaw clenched so hard the muscles in his neck strained. "I am the lead technical commander for Aegis Vanguard. If you leave me and my liaison officer behind, your incident command loses the entire grid." "The hard drives can be handed over to me," the captain countered flatly. "The civilian stays." That was the exact moment Serafina looked past the captain's shoulder and saw me stepping out from the shadows of the barricade. Her perfectly manicured fingers dug brutally into Thaddeus's arm. Thaddeus snapped his head around, following her terrified gaze. For 3 agonizing seconds, his face was entirely devoid of human emotion. A blank slate. Then panic flared in his eyes, quickly buried beneath a sudden violent surge of rage. Calliope, what the hell are you doing here? He didn't ask, are you injured? He didn't say, thank God you're safe. He didn't ask how I made it past the National Guard perimeter. What the hell are you doing here? I stepped fully into the harsh, unyielding glare of the halogen floodlights. I came to find my husband. This is an active mass casualty zone. Thaddeus marched toward me, grabbing my elbow and attempting to forcibly steer me back into the shadows, lowering his voice into the venomous hiss he reserved for when I embarrassed him at society dinners. You need to turn around and walk back to the civilian triage tents right now. This is not the time for your hysterical theatrics. It seems like exactly the time. The rescue captain stepped forward, placing a heavy gloved hand on Thaddeus's chest, forcing him to release my arm. Back off, Thorne. Who is this woman? Thaddeus hesitated. In that fraction of a second, his entire life hung in the balance. And he chose poorly. She's my wife, I announced, my voice cutting through the rotor wash like shattered glass. Calliope Vance Thorne. The captain's eyes darted down to his tablet, a look of grim realization dawning on his weathered face. Thaddeus panicked. She's emotionally unstable, Captain. We are currently separated. She has 0 authorization to be in this restricted hot zone. Serafina clamped a hand over her mouth, playing the terrified victim flawlessly. Callie, please, you're being irrational. It's incredibly dangerous here with the aftershocks. Let the professionals work. We can discuss our interpersonal issues later. Safety comes first. I looked at the $600 waterproof jacket she was wearing, my husband's jacket. I looked at Thaddeus's hand, which had reflexively moved back to rest protectively on Serafina's hip. Thaddeus, I said, locking my eyes onto his. Am I on the priority evacuation manifest? His eyes darted frantically between me, Serafina, and the heavily armed National Guardsman approaching the landing zone. Stop it, Calliope, he hissed. Answer the question. No, he lied, his voice loud enough for the flight crew to hear. You are not. You were never assigned to this operational grid. You need to proceed to the civilian holding area and wait for the non-essential bus convoy. The captain looked at his tablet, his brow furrowing deeply. I took a deliberate step closer to the military officer. So you are officially stating on the record to an emergency operations commander during a state of crisis that your legal spouse is not prioritized for this extraction. I am stating the operational facts. Thaddeus barked, losing control. Mr. Thorne, the captain's voice was deep, resonant, and laced with absolute disgust. That is not what my county database says. Thaddeus froze. The blood drained from his face. The captain turned the glowing screen of the ruggedized iPad toward him. Tier 1 Family Safety Exemption. Verified spouse Calliope Vance Thorne. This final seat belongs to her. He tapped the glass for emphasis. The county update finally pushed through. This seat was reserved for her the entire time. For a long, surreal moment, the only sound was the thumping of the helicopter blades. Then the murmurs among the flight crew began. A combat medic adjusting oxygen tanks muttered an audible curse. A firefighter nearby shook his head. Serafina slowly pulled her hand away from Thaddeus, her survival instinct overriding her affection. Thaddeus scrambled, his silver tongue failing him. It's a glitch. The manifest was officially amended. She had no security clearance too. Too late, I interrupted softly. I reached inside my collar. I didn't pull out the drive. Instead, I pulled out my iPhone, synced to the drive's cloud backup, and pressed play on the audio file Evander had cleaned up. Thaddeus's own arrogant voice blasted through my phone's speakers, amplified by the stark silence of the people watching us. Of course she signed it. Applied a tiny bit of pressure. Threw in some corporate buzzwords about my promotion. And she folded. She always folds. Serafina's recorded voice echoed next, tinny but unmistakable. And the emergency manifest, handled. You and I are locked into the Tier 1 Rotary Wing evacuation group, and Calliope is irrelevant. If there's actual chaos, no one is going to waste fuel worrying about a redundant spouse. I pressed. Stop. The rotors kept spinning. The dust kept swirling. But the universe immediately surrounding Thaddeus Thorne had utterly collapsed. His face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated horror. Serafina backed away from him as if he were radioactive, whispering, "Oh my God, Thad." The rescue captain stared at Thaddeus with a look of profound revulsion that no amount of military discipline could mask. Mr. Thorne, step away from my aircraft. Captain, you don't understand the context. I understand perfectly. You engineered a fraudulent manifest to leave your wife in a collapse zone so you could extract your mistress. You are now officially a liability to my flight deck. Back the hell up. Thaddeus lunged toward the metal stairs, pure desperation overtaking his logic. Two heavily geared National Guardsmen intercepted him, instantly driving their forearms into his chest and shoving him backward onto the cracked tarmac before he even touched the handrail. "No," Thaddeus screamed, his voice cracking. "I have to get out of here. You can't leave me in this zone." The captain ignored him entirely and pointed a thick, gloved finger at me. "Calliope Vance Thorne, you are confirmed Tier 1. Board the aircraft." I walked past Thaddeus. His face was contorted in a grotesque mask of panic and disbelief. Callie, wait, you can't do this. Tell them." I paused at the bottom of the aluminum steps and looked down at him. For 5 agonizing years, I had waited for this man to look at me as if I truly mattered, as if my existence was essential to his survival. Now he finally was, but only because I held the literal ticket to his salvation. I didn't say a single word. I turned my back to him, gripped the handrail, and climbed into the belly of the Black Hawk. A crew chief slammed the heavy sliding door shut instantly, severing Thaddeus's screams from my reality. As the massive helicopter lifted off the ground, pitching forward into the dark Seattle sky, I looked out the reinforced porthole window. Down below, illuminated by the flashing red strobes, Thaddeus was being physically restrained by 2 soldiers. Serafina was sitting on a chunk of broken concrete several yards away, his expensive Patagonia jacket slipping off her shoulders into the mud, completely abandoning him. I didn't feel a triumphant surge of vindication. I didn't feel the thrill of cinematic revenge. I just felt a massive hollow wave of exhaustion wash over my bones. My marriage didn't end in a sterile courtroom in King County, or in a screaming match in our designer kitchen. It ended precisely the moment my husband tried to barter my life for his mistress's seat on a helicopter. At the FEMA Triage Center, established at a high school football stadium 30 miles east in Bellevue, a military medic cleaned a nasty laceration on my forehead and told me how incredibly lucky I was to have made it out of the hot zone. I almost laughed. Luck had absolutely nothing to do with it. Evander Sterling arrived just before dawn. He strode into the gymnasium, wearing a sharply tailored suit that looked entirely out of place among the mylar blankets and cots. He was carrying a thick leather briefcase, a secure laptop, and the intense, hyper-focused expression of a man who hadn't slept in 48 hours. He visually inspected my bandages, asked 3 rapid-fire questions about my neurological status, and then pulled up a folding metal chair. "Walk me through every single second." I told him everything. By 6:30 a.m., Evander's associates had officially filed the revocation of the power of attorney in King County Superior Court. They filed the ex parte temporary restraining order, freezing every cent of our liquid assets. They filed the preservation demands with Aegis Vanguard Infrastructure's legal department, and they had a 60-page divorce petition loaded into the electronic filing system, ready to submit the moment I gave the verbal command. By 7:15 a.m., Evander had securely transmitted the audio recordings, the falsified county manifest documents, the fraudulent promissory notes, and the Fairmont Olympic Hotel receipts to a contact at the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office, specifically the division handling corporate fraud and emergency mismanagement. At 8:00 a.m., a FEMA transport bus arrived at the stadium. Thaddeus and Serafina stepped off the bus. They were not greeted as elite corporate survivors. They were flanked by 2 grim-faced state troopers. They looked absolutely destroyed. Serafina's designer clothes were ruined, her hair matted to her skull with gray dust. Thaddeus's bespoke shirt was torn, his face smeared with soot, and the bags under his eyes looked like bruises. He spotted me sitting on a cot near the bleachers. He broke away from the processing line, stumbling toward me with the pathetic, frantic gait of a man who realizes he is standing on the trapdoor of a gallows. "Callie," he rasped, his voice shredded from the dust and screaming. "Callie, please. You have to let me explain." I didn't stand up. I simply looked at him. "No, Thaddeus. I really don't." I panicked. I made a terrible split-second misjudgment in the chaos. Serafina was terrified, and I was just trying to manage the logistics. By telling a military rescue pilot that your wife was redundant, I asked, my voice echoing off the gymnasium walls. His mouth opened, then snapped shut. Serafina materialized behind him, tears cutting clean tracks through the dirt on her face. "Callie, please," Serafina sobbed, attempting to grasp my hand. "It was a massive misunderstanding. Thad didn't want to hurt you. He was under immense pressure from the board." I stared blankly at her outstretched hand until she awkwardly withdrew it. "Serafina, you actively conspired to fabricate federal debt ledgers under my name. You illegally commandeered a military-grade emergency transponder meant for actual first responders. You openly mocked the idea of leaving me in an earthquake zone. Save the melodramatic performance for your defense attorney. Her tears stopped instantly. Her eyes hardened into panicked slits. Thaddeus flinched. Defense attorney, what are you talking about? Evander stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate, lethal slowness. She means me, Thaddeus, but I won't be defending you. Evander Thaddeus looked at the lawyer, his brain struggling to process the ambush. What the hell is going on here? We filed the revocation of your fraudulent power of attorney at dawn, Evander stated, his voice booming, with the practiced authority of a seasoned litigator. We secured an emergency freeze on all joint assets. We submitted notices of financial fraud to the court. We have formally submitted the digital evidence of your embezzlement and the falsified evacuation manifest to the district attorney. Oh, and the divorce petition hits the docket at 9:00 a.m. All the remaining color drained from Thaddeus's face, leaving him looking like a corpse. Callie, don't do this. You can't nuke my entire life over one mistake. I finally stood up. I stepped within inches of his chest. A mistake, I whispered, my voice laced with absolute venom. The Tom Ford lipstick in your Audi was a mistake. The 14 nights at the Fairmont were mistakes. The fabricated promissory notes intended to steal my townhouse were mistakes. The forged executive order to strip my emergency clearance was a mistake. Looking a rescue pilot in the eye and telling him I didn't matter was a mistake. I tilted my head. Exactly how many mistakes have to happen before we legally define it as a premeditated choice? Before Thaddeus could formulate a lie, his iPhone buzzed violently in his pocket. He pulled it out with trembling hands. He looked at the caller ID and froze. Answer it, I commanded. He swiped the screen and put it to his ear. I could hear the voice on the other end, the chief executive officer of Aegis Vanguard Infrastructure. The voice was cold, corporate, and brutally brief. Aegis Vanguard was suspending him indefinitely effective, immediately pending a full federal investigation. The board of directors had permanently revoked his security clearance. The State Emergency Division was demanding his immediate surrender of all corporate devices. All project equity and unvested stock options were frozen. He was ordered to cease all contact with stakeholders and secure personal legal counsel. Sir, it's a temporary misunderstanding, Thaddeus stammered, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine. I can explain the optics. The line went dead. The phone slipped from his numb fingers, clattering against the gymnasium floor. For a terrifying moment, he stood as still as a statue. Then his shoulders collapsed. The impenetrable armor of Thaddeus Thorne shattered. He looked at me and his eyes filled with genuine, desperate tears. Callie, he whimpered, falling to his knees right there on the scuffed hardwood floor of the high school gym. Callie, we've been together since Reed. You remember? We were 21. He reached frantically into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. His hands shook violently as he dumped the contents into his palm. It was the cheap, tarnished silver promise ring he had bought me from a pawn shop in Portland when we were broke college students. The silver was oxidized, almost black along the edges. I kept it, he sobbed, holding it up to me like a religious relic. I always kept it in my travel bag. I lost my way, Callie. I got infected by the corporate greed. I was stupid. I was arrogant. But I loved you first. Please, let me fix this. Let us start over. He reached out and wrapped his fingers bruisingly tight around my wrist. Evander moved instantly. Take your hands off my client right now. Thaddeus ignored him, his nails digging into my skin. Callie, please, you can't destroy me. I am your husband. I looked down at his desperate grip. Then I reached inside my collar and peeled away the edge of the waterproof medical tape. Thaddeus's weeping eyes tracked the movement. I pulled the black microvolt drive from my chest and dangled it by its lanyard between us. The tiny LED light blinked a menacing, steady crimson. All the theatrical sorrow vanished from his face, replaced by a much darker, much more primal emotion. Absolute terror. What? What is that? He whispered. I pressed the red node. A soft electronic chirp echoed in the space between us. This, I said loudly, ensuring my voice carried across the triage center, is the reason you don't get to rewrite history. A state police captain, who had been quietly observing the altercation from the perimeter, stepped closer. I turned my attention directly to him. Captain, I said clearly, this device is a localized EMP-shielded audio recorder. It contains high-fidelity recordings from the Rainier Annex extraction zone. It has crystal-clear audio of Thaddeus Thorne stating I was not on the priority list, admitting I was non-essential, and attempting to coerce military personnel into abandoning me in a collapse zone. Thaddeus tried to lung for it. Give me that. Evander threw his shoulder into Thaddeus's chest, knocking him back onto the floor. Furthermore, I continued staring down at my husband. It contains decrypted cloud-synced audio from our private residence. It features Mr. Thorne and Miss Delacroix explicitly discussing their conspiracy to manipulate a federal safety manifest, commit marital asset fraud via a falsified power of attorney, and deliberately abandon me in the event of an actual casualty event. The encrypted files are currently sitting in the King County District Attorney's secure inbox. Thaddeus scrambled backward like a cornered animal. "Callie, stop! You're psychotic." "No," I replied softly. "I am simply meticulous." I looked back at the state police officer. "I am officially pressing charges against Thaddeus Thorne for criminal endangerment, federal wire fraud, falsification of emergency response data, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny." Two state troopers instantly converged on Thaddeus, grabbing him by the armpits and hauling him roughly to his feet. He thrashed wildly, his polished veneer completely gone, the tarnished silver ring flying from his hand and bouncing into a drainage grate on the floor. "You're ruining my life," he screamed, spit flying from his lips, as the troopers forced his arms behind his back and ratcheted steel handcuffs onto his wrists. "You vindictive bitch. You have no right to do this to me." The police captain keyed his shoulder radio. "Dispatch, I need a transport unit at Sector 3. We have an uncooperative male suspect under arrest for criminal fraud and endangerment." They dragged Thaddeus away face first. He kicked and screamed the entire way out the double doors. Serafina collapsed onto a folding chair, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving as she sobbed so violently her teeth chattered. I looked at both of their retreating forms, and for the first time in 5 years I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of peace. It wasn't joy. It wasn't triumph. It was absolute crystalline clarity. Love had made me patient. Betrayal had made me cautious. The instinct to survive had made me ruthless. The ensuing weeks played out like a highly coordinated, controlled demolition. Aegis Vanguard Infrastructure, terrified of the catastrophic PR nightmare involving a massive federal DHS contract, fired Thaddeus Thorne with cause stripping him of his severance package and golden parachute. His name and headshot were scrubbed from the corporate website within hours. They issued a sterile press release citing gross ethical misconduct during a state emergency, deliberately omitting my name to avoid further scandal. The King County District Attorney did not hesitate. They executed a search warrant on Thaddeus's electronics. Cybercrimes investigators recovered the metadata from his hard drives, definitively proving he and Serafina had authored the fraudulent debt ledgers. They retrieved the text messages outlining their plan to invoke the power of attorney to liquidate my Vanguard accounts if I was injured or killed in an earthquake. They found the requisition forms for the stolen GPS transponders. Facing multiple felony indictments, Serafina immediately flipped. She offered to testify against Thaddeus, claiming he had manipulated and coerced her. Thaddeus, in turn, attempted to claim Serafina had blackmailed him. The prosecutor didn't care. The digital paper trail was bulletproof. Cordelia Thorne began calling my new burner phone from blocked numbers, leaving unhinged, weeping voicemails. "You have destroyed my son. He loved you. You are a cold, calculated monster. Please, Calliope, I am begging you. Do not send my boy to federal prison." I forwarded every single voicemail directly to Evander to be added to the harassment file. The divorce proceedings were a bloodbath. Washington is a community property state, but the introduction of deliberate financial fraud, the attempt to hide assets, and the fraudulent power of attorney gave Evander the leverage to utterly destroy Thaddeus's legal defense. The divorce petition did not read like a wife quietly asking for her freedom. It read like a forensic audit of a stolen life. It demanded full restitution of my parents' inheritance, a disproportionate split of the remaining liquid assets due to his financial abuse, massive civil damages for intentional infliction of emotional distress, and a permanent restraining order. During the initial deposition, conducted via secure Zoom link from the King County Correctional Facility, Thaddeus looked 10 years older. His sharp jawline was obscured by a patchy, unkempt beard. The bespoke suits were replaced by an oversized orange jumpsuit. The terrifying arrogance that used to command boardrooms had completely evaporated. His court-appointed defense attorney weakly argued that the Queen Anne townhouse was marital property and should be split 50-50. Evander effortlessly produced the wire transfers and the signed text messages where Thaddeus acknowledged the money was my family's inheritance. His attorney argued the fabricated debt to Serafina was a legitimate marital burden. Evander played Serafina's tearful confession tape from the police precinct, where she admitted she had never loaned him a dime. His attorney desperately tried to argue that Thaddeus's actions at the helicopter pad were the result of acute post-traumatic stress and operational confusion. Evander simply pressed a button and played the audio of Thaddeus laughing with his mistress about leaving his redundant spouse behind. The presiding family court judge actually took off her reading glasses, rubbed her temples, and muted her microphone to sigh. That was the moment I knew Thaddeus Thorne was legally and entirely dead. Outside the King County Courthouse, after the final hearing, Cordelia was waiting for me. She looked frail. Her posture, usually rigid with aristocratic pride, was slumped. Her meticulously dyed blonde hair showed a stark inch of gray roots. Her hands shook violently as she clutched a paper coffee cup. "Calliope," she rasped. Evander stepped smoothly between us, his hand hovering near his jacket pocket. I raised a finger signaling him to stand down. I was perfectly fine. Cordelia's eyes brimmed with tears. "I am sorry. I didn't blink. I didn't speak. I raised him wrong," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I raised him to believe the world owed him everything. I taught him that a wife's only purpose was to absorb his burdens. I treated you like the help because making you feel small made me feel powerful. I met Serafina once. I knew what they were doing. I told myself boys will be boys, even though he was a grown man." She let out a ragged sob. "I am so incredibly sorry. It was a beautiful apology. And it was exactly 5 years too late to matter." I let her cry. She reached into her quilted Chanel purse and pulled out a thick white envelope. "This is everything his father and I can liquidate without selling the estate. It's $80,000. I know it doesn't fix anything, but please, take it. Keep your money, Cordelia." She blinked, stunned. "Please, Callie." "I am not going to forgive Thaddeus," I said, my voice as calm and flat as a frozen lake. "I will never forgive what he did. But I am also not going to take your guilt money to validate your conscience. Keep it. Pay for his commissary. And do not ever contact me again." I turned on my heel and walked away before her pity could morph back into an emotional trap. The divorce was finalized 4 months after the earthquake. The judge awarded me the Queen Anne townhouse as sole and separate property protected by an ironclad civil judgment against Thaddeus that would garnish any future wages he might ever earn. I received 85% of our liquid marital assets. Aegis Vanguard Infrastructure paid out a massive, highly confidential non-disclosure settlement to avoid a civil lawsuit regarding their negligence in the emergency simulation. The criminal trial concluded shortly after. Faced with insurmountable digital evidence, Thaddeus accepted a brutal plea deal. He was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison for wire fraud, criminal endangerment, and forgery. Serafina received a 3-year sentence in a minimum security facility for her role in the financial conspiracy and obstruction of justice. When Evander called me to deliver the final verdict, I was sitting cross-legged on the hardwood floor of the townhouse, surrounded by brown cardboard moving boxes. "It's legally over, Callie," Evander said gently. I looked around the cavernous, empty rooms. The kitchen where I had cooked his meals, the hallway where I had listened to him plot my demise, the foyer where I had pretended not to smell another woman's perfume. "No," I replied softly. "Now it legally begins." 2 weeks later, I sold the townhouse to a tech executive for 20% over the asking price. I took a significant portion of the profits and established an anonymous trust fund for the families of the blue-collar workers who had been injured during the Rainier Annex collapse. I donated another massive sum to a Seattle-based legal aid clinic specializing in representing women trapped in financially abusive marriages. The remainder of the money became my new foundation. Before I drove out of Washington State for good, I took a detour down I-5 toward the Rainier Annex. The rubble had been entirely cleared away. Tall chain-link fences surrounded the leveled earth. Giant billboard signs promised resilient reconstruction and a brighter tomorrow. Green weeds were already pushing their way stubbornly through the cracked asphalt near the perimeter. I stood near the exact coordinates where the Black Hawk helicopter had idled. I pulled the black microvault drive from my pocket. It had executed its final protocol flawlessly. The audio files were permanently secured in Evander's encrypted vault, and the physical drive had been wiped clean. It was now just a hollow shell of plastic and silicon. I walked over to a patch of soft dirt near the fence line, used the heel of my boot to dig a shallow hole and drop the drive inside. I kicked the dirt over it. No tombstone. No dramatic eulogy, just dirt the damp wind off the Puget Sound and the quiet permanent burial of the artifact that had saved my life. A week later, I flew to Sedona, Arizona. Evander met me at SeaTac Airport to see me off. "Text me the second you land at Sky Harbor," he ordered, handing me my carry-on bag and double-checking the zipper like a worried parent. "Yes, Mom," I teased. He smiled, but his dark eyes were intensely serious. "I mean it, Calliope. I know." We stood near the TSA security checkpoint, the chaotic noise of the airport fading into the background. Both of us were acutely aware of the heavy, unspoken things lingering in the air. Evander had been my bulldog, my confidant, my shield, and at times the only person on earth who believed the depths of my terror before the evidence proved it to the world. Throughout the entire brutal legal campaign, he had maintained absolute respectful professionalism. He never crossed a line. He never used my vulnerability as a stepping stone. That immense restraint meant more to me than any grand romantic gesture ever could, Callie Evander said softly, his hands tucked into his suit pockets. I am not asking for anything right now, but if there ever comes a day when you are ready to let someone try to earn your trust again, I would very much like the opportunity to submit my application. My throat tightened. I swallowed hard against the lump forming there. I'm not ready, Evander. I know, he replied instantly. But I looked up at him, offering the first truly genuine, unguarded smile I had worn in half a decade. When I am ready, you will be the first person I call. His smile mirrored mine, soft, patient, and deeply real. That was enough. Sedona gave me the sky. An impossibly vast, aggressively blue, unbroken expanse of sky. The towering red rock formations, Cathedral Rock, Bell Rock, burned a brilliant, fiery orange as the sun set over the high desert. The dry, arid air smelled faintly of juniper pine and ozone after the sudden monsoon rains. There were no screeching sirens, no corporate galas, no hushed, condescending whispers. I spent my mornings waking up without an alarm. I spent my afternoons wandering through eclectic art galleries nestled in the canyons, introducing myself simply as Callie, a woman with no past and no obligations. I leased a small sun-drenched adobe casita tucked behind the property of a retired silver sculptor. The heavy wooden windows looked out toward the rust-colored mountains. The kitchen was tiny. The bed was firm, and the profound silence of the desert never once felt like an accusation. For the first month, I just slept. For the second month, I hiked the red dirt trails until my legs burned and my lungs expanded with clean air. By the third month, I bought a camera. Actually, Evander bought it. He shipped a professional-grade DSLR to the casita 2 weeks before my 32nd birthday. Inside the box was a heavy cardstock note. Record the beautiful things now. Your life finally has room for them. I took the camera out to the Coconino National Forest at dusk and photographed the silver moon rising over the jagged mesas. I took pictures of weathered turquoise doors, ancient Spanish missions, local artisan markets, and resilient desert wildflowers blooming violently out of the cracks in the unforgiving stone. One evening, I received a piece of forwarded mail from my old Seattle P.O. box. It was a handwritten letter from Thaddeus's father, Arthur. The handwriting was shaky and frail. Thaddeus wants to see you. He has things he needs to confess to clear his soul. Cordelia's health is failing. We will not bother you again. The $80,000 is still sitting in an escrow account if you ever want it. I sat on the porch of the casita holding the heavy parchment paper and watched the desert sun dip below the horizon, bleeding violet and bruised peach across the clouds. Then I calmly tore the letter perfectly in half and then into quarters and dropped it into the recycling bin. The next morning, I anonymously wired $40,000 directly to Cordelia Thorne's private medical care account. I took the remaining $40,000 and established a permanent scholarship fund for female law students at Reed College, under the name Calliope Vance. It wasn't an act of forgiveness. It was the final closing of a heavy rusted door. That night, I laid flat on the warm, flat roof of my adobe casita, my camera resting on my chest, and watched the desert stars ignite one by one in the inky blackness above. I thought about the 21-year-old Thaddeus, handing me a cheap silver ring with trembling, earnest hands. I thought about the 34-year-old Thaddeus, violently shoving me aside to prioritize his mistress on a military helicopter, while I stood bleeding in the dust. Both versions of that man were real. The ultimate tragedy wasn't that our love had been a lie from the very beginning. The tragedy was that some people choose to systematically murder the absolute best, most honorable versions of themselves, and then have the sheer audacity to demand you keep loving the ghost they left behind. I refuse to love ghosts anymore. My phone vibrated against the adobe roof tiles. Evander, how is the sky looking out there tonight? I lifted the heavy camera, adjusted the aperture, and snapped a long exposure shot of the Milky Way stretching over the jagged silhouette of Cathedral Rock. I attached the image to a text message and hit send. Callie, it's bigger than I remembered. Evander, good. Keep taking up space. I smiled into the darkness, a quiet, fierce joy blooming in my chest. For the first time in my adult life, the future didn't feel like a claustrophobic hallway lined with heavy locked doors. It felt like the open desert. It was vast, occasionally harsh, relentlessly bright, and it belonged entirely to me, stretching out in absolutely every direction. I had no husband demanding my obedience. I had no mother-in-law to appease with perfectly arranged centerpieces. I had no fabricated debts chained to my name. I had no impending disasters waiting to dictate whether or not my life was deemed essential. I was essential simply because I existed. I mattered because I decided I did. And that was more than enough. In the distance, the warm Arizona wind swept through the dry sagebrush, making a soft rustling sound like the turning of a heavy page in a very long book. I lifted the camera to my eye, focused the lens on the brightest star in the constellation, and pressed the shutter. Click. The sky stretched out forever. And this time I wasn't an erased name on someone else's manifest. I was the one holding the records. I was the one choosing the coordinates. I was the one deciding exactly where to fly.